Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with Dave's Faves. And of course, I could not do a Dave's Faves without talking about the Franck Symphony in D minor. And I could not talk about the Franck Symphony in D minor without talking about the greatest performance of the Franck Symphony in D minor and my personal favorite, Monteux with the Chicago Symphony, gloriously recorded in living stereo. Oh, it's fabulous. This is such an important recording. Not only it's just a classic version of the Franck, one of those effortlessly organic, flowing, intelligent, propulsive performances for which Monteux was absolutely famous. But beyond that, for the history of performance practice, it's something that the period instrument people love to ignore. Why? Because Monteux recorded this in, what was the year here? Let's see, it does tell us. There we go. 1959. Now, in 1959, he was in his 80s, around there, and still in perfectly good shape. I mean, there was no slowing down. There was no sense of frailty, nothing. He had complete command over his faculties, but he was at the premiere of the Franck Symphony in D minor in 1888. He was 12, which means he was old enough to understand what he was listening to. He was already being trained as a musician and, playing string quartets for Brahms only a few years later. So this is a guy who knew his music. And he knew Franck, apparently. Anyway, whether he knew Franck or not, I don't know. But he knew the music. And he was there at the creation. So we have a direct link to the creation of the work. And that time span, covers exactly the period that the more lunatic fringe of the period instrument universe claims when, orchestral sound went from total non-vibrato, inexpressive, cold string tone to total vibrato. Always, constant, glutinous, disgusting, whatever vibrato. It's nonsense. And here's the evidence that it's nonsense. You honestly think that this guy who grew up and was trained in that supposedly earlier style of performance, who attended the premiere of this iconic work in the French orchestral repertoire and the late Romantic Symphony, would have for 1 minute tolerated an orchestra playing it in a completely unidiomatic style? Really? Do you think that? I don't. And no one has satisfactorily explained to me why, of all of the conductors who were around at this time playing the late Romantic repertoire that we all love, and there were a bunch. I mean, there was Toscanini, there was Koussevitzky, there was Adrian Bolt, there were a lot of them born in the 1880s and 90s or before. Why not a single one of them fetched about the excessive use of vibrato in late Romantic music? None of them ever said anything about it. Sure, they might have told occasionally in certain passages, play it this way, play it that way. But nobody was saying that the sound of the orchestra was terrible or worse or inappropriate. No, they were thrilled. They couldn't wait to get their hands on a nice, young, juicy American or British or German or French orchestra and whip them into shape. And the shape they whipped them into was this. Modern orchestral sound as we know it. They loved it. They loved every bit of it. So there, take that and stick that in your pipe and smoke it. So not only is it a great performance, it is an important performance historically. It is a real connection to the 19th century performance tradition. And the other thing we learn from this performance, and I think actually it's a very, very interesting sort of perspective on this, is that there have always been basically two kinds of musicians. There have been the interventionist musicians, the ones who muck around with everything, the Leopold Stokowskis, the Hans von Bülows, those guys. And then there have been the ones who are very respectful of what the composer wrote, generally speaking, and who play the notes more or less as written. You know, the Toscaninis, Monteux was one of them. It's two sides of the performance coin. They have always existed side by side. The idea that there was this slushy, slurpy, sloppy romantic style, which was supplanted by this sort of objectivist, more, dedicated, literal style, with more steadier tempos. No, this is just not true. I mean, they existed when Berlioz and Wagner were in England, in London, conducting. Berlioz was a classicist. His conducting tended to be strict in time and fairly non-interventionist, all things considered. Wagner's, on the other hand, was all over the place in terms of tempo and stretchy and romantic, and like Wagner's own music. They're not mutually exclusive, and it's wrong to generalize about whole epics based on that sort of nonsense. So let's get back to the point. Franck, Symphony in D minor. Pierre Monteux, Chicago Symphony, coupled, by the way, with a stunning Stravinsky Petrushka with the Boston Symphony. Another great Monteux performance. And they're in glorious living stereo. That was recorded in 1960. Just two of the great classics of the gramophone. Here they are. But today we're talking about the Franck, and this is the one you got to get. Everything else you can enjoy as well. There are many other performances in many other styles that are equally valid and very, very enjoyable. But this, I really believe, is special. I really do. And I love it. I just love it. Fabulous. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you for joining me. Take care.